Selivan Prime looked like something out of a dream. The planet's surface was covered in crystalline towers that caught the light of its twin suns and scattered it into rainbows that drifted across the sky like living things. Floating platforms hung in the air above the cities, connected by bridges of light, and the atmosphere hummed with the quiet buzz of 1,000 different communication frequencies from hundreds of species going about their daily lives. It was beautiful and overwhelming, and it made the crew of the Steadfast feel very small. The ship was escorted to a high-orbit docking ring, where dozens of other vessels from across the galaxy were already gathered. Holt stood at the bridge window and looked at the collection of ships. There were sleek Athkari cruisers with their insect-wing solar arrays. There were massive Rethian dreadnoughts, dark and silent. There were delicate Terulian scout ships that looked like they were made of glass, and there were many others he did not recognize at all, from species he had never encountered. "This is not a normal gathering," Amy said from beside him. "They are all here to watch." "Good," Holt said, though he was not sure he meant it. Ambassador Calloway came aboard within the hour. He looked tired. His suit was pressed and his hair was combed, but there were shadows under his eyes that told Holt the man had not been sleeping well. He gathered Holt and the senior staff in the briefing room and laid out the situation. "The tribute ceremony is in 2 days," Calloway said. "Tradition requires us to submit our acceptance speech in advance, so it can be translated into every council language. I have spent the last 3 weeks writing one." He placed a datapad on the table. "It is 12 pages. I would like you all to read it and give me your thoughts." The crew read the speech. It was, by any fair measure, a good piece of writing. Calloway had always been skilled with words. The speech thanked the council for its recognition of humanity's sacrifice. It praised the spirit of interstellar cooperation. It expressed hope for continued partnership and mutual growth. It was respectful, measured, and diplomatic. It was exactly the kind of speech that every other honored species had given for 12,000 years. Amy Schultz finished reading first. "It is perfect," she said. "It is exactly what they will expect." Holt read it twice. He said nothing for a long time. The room waited. "Let me sleep on it," he finally said. Calloway looked at him with the careful expression of a man who could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. "Danny, the submission deadline is tomorrow evening." "I know. Let me sleep on it." That night, while most of the crew rested, the galaxy continued to turn around them. On the surface of Selivan Prime, in a quiet restaurant tucked behind one of the lesser diplomatic towers, a young Rethian delegate named Sarin sat across from a Terulian journalist named Gorvash. Sarin was young by Rethian standards, barely a century old, and she carried herself with the stiff posture of someone who had been trained from birth to represent her people. But her eyes were different from those of most Rethian officials. There was something restless in them, something that looked very much like doubt. "I need you to understand something," Sarin said quietly, her translator converting her words into Gorvash's native tongue. The Dominion did not agree to this tribute out of respect for the humans. They agreed because they want something. Gorvash leaned forward. He was small, even for a Terulian, and his translucent skin flickered with the pale bioluminescent patterns that his species used to express curiosity. "What do they want?" "They intend to use the ceremony as leverage. After the tribute, they will present humanity with a military pact. It would limit Earth's fleet expansion and place human vessels under partial council oversight. The tribute is meant to put humans in a position where refusing the pact would look ungrateful." Gorvash was silent for a moment. "That is clever." "That is cruel," Sarin said. "These people bled for us, all of us, and we are going to use their honor as a leash." She stood and left the restaurant without another word. Gorvash sat alone for a long time, thinking about what she had said and wondering if he was brave enough to report it. Back on the Steadfast, Captain Holt could not sleep. He walked the corridors of his ship in the low light of the night cycle, his boots quiet on the metal floors. The ship was never truly silent. There was always the hum of the engines, the soft clicking of the life support systems, the distant murmur of someone on watch. These were the sounds that had been his home for 20 years. He found himself outside the enlisted quarters on Deck 4. The door was open, and a thin light spilled out into the corridor. He looked inside and saw Chris Langley sitting on the edge of his bunk, holding a folded flag in his hands. Holt knew that flag. He had seen Langley take it out before, always when the young man thought no one was watching. It was the burial flag of Langley's older brother, Petty Officer First Class Kevin Langley, who had served aboard the destroyer Resolute during the border collapse. The Resolute had been one of the 37 ships lost at the Corvin line. There had been no survivors. Holt stepped into the room. Langley looked up, but did not try to hide the flag. "Could not sleep either?" Holt asked. "No, sir," Langley replied. Holt sat down on the bunk across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The ship hummed around them. "I read the ambassador's speech," Langley said at last. "It is a good speech." "It is," Holt agreed. "It says all the right things. It is polite, it is grateful." Langley paused. He ran his thumb along the edge of the folded flag. "But it does not say what happened. Not really. It does not talk about the calls we sent out. It does not talk about the silence. It does not say that my brother died waiting for help that was never coming." Holt watched the young man's face. There was no anger in it. That was the thing about Langley. There never was. There was just a sadness so deep and so quiet that it made Holt's chest ache. "I do not want them to feel guilty," Langley said. "That is not what I mean. I just want them to know. I want them to understand what it was like. Not the politics of it, not the strategy, just what it felt like to be alone out there." Holt nodded. He reached out and put his hand on Langley's shoulder for a moment, then stood up. "Get some rest if you can," he said. He walked back to his quarters. The corridors were empty, and the ship was as quiet as it ever got. He sat down at his desk and opened a blank screen. Calloway's speech sat in the corner of the display, all 12 pages of it, polished and proper and full of the right words. Holt deleted it. He sat in the silence for a long time. He thought about Kevin Langley, who had been 25 years old when the Resolute went down. He thought about Commander Jill Hartman, who had rammed her crippled frigate into a Vraxian carrier to buy time for the evacuation transports. He thought about the colony on Fremont's World, where 14,000 civilians had waited for rescue ships that never arrived. He thought about the silence, the long, terrible silence of a galaxy that had chosen to look away. Then he leaned forward and typed a single word on the blank screen. He stared at it for a long time. It looked very small. It looked like nothing at all. But it was the only honest thing he had. He saved the file, turned off the screen, and went to bed. For the first time in days, he slept. The Chamber of Echoes was carved into the heart of the largest mountain on Selovan Prime. It had been built over 9,000 years ago by a species that no longer existed, and it had been expanded and maintained by the Council ever since. The chamber was vast. Its ceiling disappeared into shadow far above, and its walls were lined with thousands of seats arranged in rising tiers that curved around a central stage like the inside of a shell. Every seat was filled. Representatives from over 400 species sat in their designated sections. The Athkari delegation occupied the highest tier, their tall insectoid forms motionless, their compound eyes reflecting the light from the floating holographic translators that drifted through the air like slow-moving stars. The Rethian section was directly across from them, a block of dark-skinned, broad-shouldered figures who sat in perfect military formation. The Tyroleans were below, their small translucent bodies glowing softly in the dim light. And scattered throughout the rest of the chamber were species of every shape and size that the galaxy had produced. Beings with wings, beings with tentacles, beings made of something that was not quite flesh and not quite stone. Beings that communicated through light and sound and vibrations that human ears could not detect. The human delegation was small. Ambassador Calloway sat in the center, flanked by Captain Holt and Lieutenant Commander Schultz. Behind them sat a dozen crew members from the Steadfast, including Chris Langley, who wore his dress uniform with the quiet care of someone who understood exactly where he was. Far away, on the surface of Earth's moon, Admiral Grace Pritchard watched the ceremony through a live feed in Fleet Command. She sat alone in her office, with the door locked. She had fought beside Holt during the border collapse, and she knew him well enough to sense that something was different today. There was something in the way he held himself, something calm and settled, like a man who had already made his decision and was at peace with it. The ceremony began with Council Arbiter Zeleth, a neutral species representative, whose role was to moderate the proceedings. Zeleth was ancient, even by galactic standards, and moved with the slow deliberation of someone who had seen enough history to know that most of it repeated itself. The Arbiter stepped to the central podium and began the traditional recitation, naming each of the 19 species that had been previously honored and describing their contributions to galactic civilization. The recitation took nearly an hour. Each name was accompanied by a brief holographic display showing the honored species and the moment that had earned them the Council's recognition. It was meant to remind everyone in the chamber of the weight of the tradition. 19 tributes in 12,000 years. This was not something the Council did lightly. When the recitation ended, High Secretary Vorun rose from his seat in the Athkari tier and descended to the podium. He was enormous, even for an Athkari. His exoskeleton was a deep amber color, cracked and scarred with age, and his movements had the careful precision of someone who had learned long ago that every gesture he made would be watched and interpreted by billions. He had led the Council for 300 years, and in that time he had become something between a politician and a monument. Vorun began to speak. His voice was translated simultaneously into every language in the chamber, and his words carried the careful weight of something that had been written and rewritten many times. He spoke of the border collapse. He described the Vraxian swarm's breach of the outer territories. He listed the systems that had fallen, the populations that had been lost, the damage that had threatened the stability of the entire galactic order. He spoke of humanity's stand at the Corvin Line, where a fleet of human vessels had held the passage for 41 days against a force that should have overwhelmed them in hours. He called it a remarkable effort. He called it a contribution worthy of recognition. He did not mention that the elder species had chosen not to help. He did not mention the unanswered distress calls. He did not mention the silence. Holt listened with his hands resting on his knees. His face showed nothing. Beside him, Amy Schultz kept her eyes forward, but her jaw was tight. Behind them, Chris Langley stared at the podium with an expression that was impossible to read. Vorun finished his address and returned to his seat. The moment had arrived. Arbiter Zeleth returned to the podium and spoke the words that had been spoken 19 times before, in 12,000 years. The Council now invites the representative of the honored species to deliver their response. Calloway began to stand. He had his speech in his hand, all 12 pages of it, folded neatly in his breast pocket. But before he could rise fully, Holt put a hand on his arm. "There has been a change," Holt said quietly. Calloway looked at him, The color drained from his face. "Danny, what are you doing?" "Trust me," Holt said. "Trust the crew." Calloway opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Holt's face and saw something there that stopped the argument before it started. He sat back down slowly, the speech still folded in his pocket. Captain Daniel Holt stood. The chamber shifted. 400 species turned their attention to the human who rose from his seat and walked toward the central podium. His boots were the only sound in the chamber, each step echoing off the ancient stone walls and carrying up into the shadows above. He reached the podium. He placed his hands on its surface. He looked out at the chamber. He saw the Athkari in their high seats, ancient and still. He saw the Rethians in their rigid formation, powerful and watchful. He saw the Tyrellians glowing softly in the dark, and the dozens of species he had no names for, creatures from worlds he would never visit, civilizations older than his entire species. He saw them all looking at him, waiting for the speech, waiting for the gratitude, waiting for humanity to say what every other honored species had said for 12,000 years. He took a breath. "Remember," he said. His voice was steady and clear, and it carried through the chamber without effort. The acoustics of the ancient room did exactly what they had been designed to do. The word reached every seat, every tier, every corner of the vast space. The holographic translators caught it and began their work, cycling the word through 400 languages, sending it out through the broadcast arrays to every member world in the galaxy. Then Holt stepped back from the podium and walked to his seat. The chamber was silent. Arbiter Zeleth waited at the edge of the stage, expecting more. There was no more. The Arbiter looked at the human delegation, then at the podium, then back again. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. No one moved, no one spoke. The translators had finished their work, and the word hung in the air in 400 languages, each one carrying the same weight. It was not gratitude, it was not celebration, it was not praise for the council or hope for cooperation. It was something else entirely. It was a mirror held up to the conscience of every species in the room. Remember what happened. Remember what you did. Remember what you did not do. The silence stretched to a full minute. In 12,000 years of council proceedings, no silence had ever lasted so long. The chamber held its breath, and across the galaxy, trillions of beings stared at their screens and felt something shift inside them, something heavy and old and long overdue. In her office on Luna, Admiral Grace Pritchard set down her coffee. Her hands were shaking. She had not cried since the border collapse. She did not cry now, but it was a near thing. In the chamber, the silence remained unbroken. No one knew what to do with it. No one knew how to follow it. So they sat, all 400 species of the Galactic Council, and they did the only thing the word had asked them to do. The silence in the Chamber of Echoes lasted nearly 3 minutes before Arbiter Zeleth finally moved. The ancient moderator crossed the stage with slow steps, looked once more at the empty podium as if confirming that the human response was truly finished, and then formally closed the ceremony. No applause followed. No murmur of conversation. The delegates filed out of the chamber in something close to shock, and for the first time in living memory, the corridors of the council complex on Sullivan Prime were quiet. The chaos came later. Within the hour, the Dominion of Reth filed a formal complaint. Their senior delegate, a massive figure in ceremonial armor, stood before the council's procedural committee and demanded that the records show humanity's response as incomplete and therefore invalid. He argued that a single word did not meet the standards of the tribute tradition. He argued that it was an insult to the council's generosity. He spoke for 20 minutes, his voice rising with each sentence, and when he was finished, High Secretary Vorun responded with a single ruling. No minimum length has ever been required for a tribute response, Vorum said. His voice was flat and tired. The word stands. The Rethian delegate left the chamber without another word. The doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed down the hallway. Aboard the Steadfast, Ambassador Calloway found Holt in the observation lounge. The ambassador's tie was loosened, and his face was pale. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke. "My career is probably over," Calloway said. "I know," Holt said. "I am sorry." "No, you are not." Calloway sat down heavily in the chair across from him. He rubbed his face with both hands and let out a long breath. "Do you have any idea what you have done? Every diplomatic channel I have is on fire. The Rethians want a formal apology. Half of the younger species are sending messages of support that I do not even know how to respond to." "What did the Terulians say?" Holt asked. Calloway paused. A strange expression crossed his face, something between disbelief and admiration. The Terulian ambassador sent a single message. It said, "We remember. We are sorry." The two men sat in silence for a while after that. On the surface of Sullivan Prime, correspondent Miriam Dalton was already working. She was a human journalist embedded with the fleet, sharp and relentless, the kind of reporter who slept 4 hours a night during a big story and considered it a luxury. She had covered the border collapse from a civilian transport and had seen things that still woke her up at night. When Holt said the word, she had been standing in the press gallery above the chamber, and she had felt it land like a physical blow. It was simple, direct, and honest, and it became the most viewed broadcast in the history of the Colonial Press Network before the day was over. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. She simply described what had happened. The ceremony, the expectation, the single word, and the silence that followed. And let the galaxy draw its own conclusions. And the galaxy did. Within 24 hours, remember was the most discussed word in galactic communications history. Every news network, on every member world, covered the story. Commentators argued. Diplomats scrambled. Ordinary citizens of dozens of species looked up the history of the border collapse, and many of them, for the first time, learned the full truth of what had happened. Not the Council's version, which spoke of a regional conflict that had been resolved through the courage of local forces. The real version. The 41 days. The unanswered calls. The ships that went silent, one by one. The colonies that burned while the elder fleets sat in safe harbors and debated procedure. The conversations that followed were not comfortable. On the Athkari homeworld, a retired war commander named Thovan sat in his private quarters and watched the broadcast alone. He was old, even by the standards of his long-lived species, and his exoskeleton was faded to a dull gray that spoke of centuries lived and battles fought. He had been a senior military advisor during the border collapse. He had been in the room when the decision was made not to send aid to the humans. He remembered the arguments that were used, that the swarm was a localized threat, that intervention would set a dangerous precedent, that the humans were too young a species to warrant the expenditure of Athkari resources. He had agreed with those arguments at the time. He had voted in favor of non-intervention, and in the years since, he had carried that vote with him like a stone in his chest. He opened a personal archive that he had kept sealed for 9 years. It contained intercepted human distress transmissions from the border collapse. He had obtained them through unofficial channels not long after the crisis ended, and he had listened to them once, alone, in this same room. Then he had sealed the archive and tried to forget. Now, he opened it again. He listened to the voices. They were calm at first, professional, requesting assistance through proper channels. Then they became urgent, then desperate. The last transmission in the archive was from a ship called the Resolute. The voice belonged to a young officer who was reporting hull breaches on multiple decks and requesting immediate evacuation support. The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Thovan sat in the silence that followed. Then he began composing a public statement. Aboard the Steadfast, the crew watched the reactions pour in from across the galaxy. Amy Schultz monitored the communication feeds from the bridge, translating messages as they arrived. Most of the elder species were angry or defensive, but the younger species, the smaller civilizations that had joined the Council in the last few thousand years and had always lived in the shadow of the elder powers, those species were responding differently. Messages began arriving addressed directly to the Steadfast. Short messages, some only a few words long. A young civilization from the far side of the galactic arm sent a message that read, "We were alone once too. We remember." A species that had been denied council membership 3 times sent a message that simply said, "Thank you for saying it." A mining collective from the border territories, the same territories that had burned during the collapse, sent a message with no words at all. Just a list of names. They're dead. Chris Langley sat at his station in the communications bay and read the messages as they came in. He did not speak. He did not need to. The messages said everything. He read the list of names from the mining collective twice, then pinned his brother's flag above his bunk, and sat on the edge of his bed with his hands folded in his lap. For the first time in years, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. The silence had been broken, and that mattered more than he knew how to say. On Luna, Admiral Grace Pritchard contacted Holt through a secure channel. She looked at him through the screen with the hard, searching gaze of a woman who had spent her career making impossible decisions and living with the consequences. "The Joint Chiefs are divided," she said. "Half of them think you just started a diplomatic crisis that will take years to repair. The other half think you just won a war without firing a shot." "What do you think?" Holt asked. Pritchard was quiet for a moment. "I think Kevin Langley would have been proud. I think all of them would have been proud." She paused. "Did you know what would happen?" "No," Holt said. "I just said the only honest thing I had." Pritchard nodded slowly and ended the call. On Sullivan Prime, in a small room in the diplomatic quarters, Delegate Sarin sat alone. The political trap that the Dominion of Reth had planned was falling apart. The military pact they had intended to spring on humanity after the ceremony was becoming impossible. The mood of the galaxy had shifted. Public sentiment was moving in a direction that the Dominion had not anticipated, and trying to push a restrictive pact on the species that had just reminded the galaxy of its greatest shame would be political suicide. Sarin opened a secure communication channel. She addressed it to Earth's diplomatic office. She sat for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the controls, knowing that what she was about to do would end her career in the Dominion and possibly much more. Then she typed the first line of her message. "I remember too. Let me help." She sent it before she could change her mind. 6 months passed, and the galaxy was not the same. It did not change all at once. It changed the way a river changes course, slowly at first, then with a force that no one could stop. The single word spoken in the Chamber of Echoes had cracked something open, something that had been sealed for a long time under layers of politics and protocol and comfortable silence. And what poured out of that crack could not be pushed back in. Elder Thavan's public statement was the first blow. The retired HFY War commander released his statement 3 days after the ceremony, and it spread across every communication network in the galaxy within hours. In it, he admitted what no official HFY voice had ever admitted, that the Conclave had received humanity's distress calls during the border collapse, and had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of the consequences, not to respond. He described the meeting where the decision was made. He named the officials who had voted. He named himself among them. And he said in words that were translated into 400 languages that it was the worst thing he had ever done. The reaction was enormous. For decades, The official Athkari position had been that the border collapse was a regional conflict that had not met the threshold for intervention. Thovan's statement destroyed that narrative in a single day. The Athkari public, many of whom had genuinely believed their government's version of events, responded with anger and shame in equal measure. Protests erupted on 3 Athkari colony worlds. The conclave's approval ratings, which had been stable for centuries, dropped by a margin that political analysts said was without precedent. And the Athkari were not the only ones. In the weeks that followed, other species came forward with their own admissions. A Terulian admiral published a personal account of the moment he received orders to withdraw his scouting fleet from the border zone, leaving human colonies exposed. A Rethian historian released classified documents showing that the Dominion had calculated the probable human casualties of non-intervention and had deemed them an acceptable variable. Each admission landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward that touched every corner of galactic civilization. The Dominion of Reth's proposed military pact never made it to a formal vote. It died quietly in committee, killed not by opposition, but by irrelevance. No delegate was willing to stand before the council and propose restrictions on the species that the galaxy had just been forced to admit it had abandoned. Delegate Sarin's secret communications with Earth's diplomatic office had helped, providing inside information about the pact's provisions and the political pressure points that could be used to dismantle it. But in truth, the pact was already dead before her information arrived. The mood of the galaxy had shifted too far. In its place, something unexpected grew. A coalition of younger species, civilizations that had joined the Council in the last few thousand years, and had always occupied the lower tiers of galactic politics, began to organize. They called themselves the Remembrance Compact, and their founding principle was simple. No species should ever be left to stand alone against a common threat. It was not a military alliance. It carried no obligation to go to war. It was a promise. A promise that if one of them called for help, the others would answer. Earth did not create the compact. It grew on its own, seeded by the conversations that had been happening on 1,000 worlds since the day Holt spoke his word. But when the compact's founders sent a formal invitation to Earth, Secretary General Laura Maddox accepted it without hesitation. Maddox was a pragmatic woman. She had been a governor before she was elected to lead the United Earth Assembly, and she understood power and politics as well as anyone alive. But she also understood moments, and she knew that this one mattered more than any trade deal or treaty she would ever sign. She addressed the assembly from the floor of the Great Hall in Geneva, and she spoke about what had happened and what it meant. She talked about the weight of a single word. She said that humanity had not spoken it to punish anyone or to start a fight. They had spoken it because it was true, and because the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, was the only foundation worth building on. She announced that Earth would open its military academies to officers from allied species for the first time in history. Not to build an army, she said, but to build trust. Because trust was the thing that had been missing at the Corvin line, and it was the thing that no treaty could create on its own. The Assembly approved the measure by a margin that surprised even Maddox. Captain Holt was offered a promotion to Admiral. He was told it was well-deserved, that his actions had changed the course of galactic diplomacy, that he had earned a place at the highest table. He declined. He sat across from Admiral Pritchard in her office on Luna, and told her, with the same quiet certainty that had carried him to the podium on Sullivan Prime, that he belonged on a ship. "I am not a politician," he said. "I am not a diplomat. I said one word, Grace. That does not make me qualified to sit behind a desk and move fleets around a map." She had known him for 15 years, and she had learned that arguing with Daniel Holt, when he had that look on his face, was like arguing with a river about which way to flow. "Where do you want to go?" she asked. The frontier, the outer territories. That is where the real work is. Not in assembly halls and committee rooms. Out there where people are still rebuilding. Where species are meeting each other face to face for the first time. That is where trust gets built. Pritchard signed the reassignment orders that afternoon. The Steadfast departed Luna 3 weeks later, bound for the outer territories on a goodwill mission that had no fixed end date. The crew was the same. Amy Schultz was at her station on the bridge, monitoring the communication channels with her usual sharp focus. Chris Langley had been promoted to communication specialist and had moved to a larger station, though he still kept his brother's flag pinned above his bunk. On the second day of the journey, Amy came to halt with a piece of information that made him stop and sit down. The word has entered the formal diplomatic lexicon of 37 species, she said. They have adopted it as an official term. It means to honor a debt of silence, the acknowledgement of a wrong committed through inaction. Holt shook his head slowly. I did not mean it as an accusation. Amy looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she thought he was being a little bit foolish. That is exactly why it worked, sir. If you had meant it as an accusation, they would have defended themselves. But you did not accuse anyone. You just asked them to remember. And once they did, they had to decide for themselves what that memory meant. You gave them the choice, and most of them chose to be honest. Holt thought about that for a long time after she left. He was not sure she was right. He was not sure he deserved the credit she was giving him. He had stood at that podium with the faces of the dead in his mind, and the silence of the galaxy in his ears. And he had said the only thing that felt true. That was all. The rest, the admissions, the compact, the academies, the shift in the way 400 species looked at each other and at themselves, that was not his doing. That was the galaxy deciding, one conversation at a time, to be better than it had been. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all a single word could do. Not change everything, but open a door that had been closed for too long and let the light in. On Celavan Prime, the Chamber of Echoes stood empty. The delegates had gone home. The broadcast arrays had been powered down. The holographic translators drifted in the dark like sleeping fireflies. A maintenance worker from a small, quiet species that most of the galaxy had never heard of moved through the chamber with a cleaning tool, wiping dust from the ancient stone surfaces. His name did not matter to the history books. He was just a person doing his job in a room where important things had happened. He reached the podium and paused. He looked up at the vast, silent chamber, at the thousands of empty seats rising into the shadows above, at the carved inscriptions on the walls, the words of every tribute response that had been given in 12,000 years of council history. Some of them were hundreds of lines long, some filled entire panels of stone. They were beautiful and grand and full of the kind of language that diplomats loved and ordinary people forgot. Beside the podium, freshly carved into the stone, was the newest inscription. It was the shortest in the chamber's history. Just one word, etched in clean, simple letters, in a language that was barely a century old by galactic standards. It read, "Remember." The maintenance worker looked at it for a long moment. He did not know much about human politics, or the border collapse, or the complicated web of alliances and resentments that held the galaxy together. But he knew what the word meant. Everyone did now. He finished his work and left the chamber, turning off the lights behind him. The word remained, carved in stone, waiting in the dark for the next person who needed to read it. And far away, on the edge of the frontier, the Steadfast moved through the stars, carrying its crew toward whatever came next. The galaxy was vast and old, and full of species that did not always understand each other. But something had changed. A crack had opened in the silence, and through it something honest had slipped in. Not a solution, not a fix, just a word, spoken by a man who had lost too much to pretend that everything was fine. It was not a weapon, it was not a demand. It was the simplest thing a species born from struggle could say to a galaxy that had watched them bleed. Do not let this happen again. Not to us, not to anyone. And the galaxy, for the first time in a very long time, listened. The deep space cruiser Steadfast was 3 days into a routine patrol along the Outer Rim trade corridor when the encrypted transmission arrived. It came through on a frequency that Captain Daniel Holt had only seen used twice in his 20-year career, and both of those times had involved the kind of news that changed the shape of things. He was sitting in his command chair, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when his communications officer looked up from her console with an expression he could not quite read. "Captain," said Lieutenant Commander Amy Schultz, "we have a priority signal from the Galactic Council's High Secretariat. It is addressed to us directly, not to Fleet Command, to us." Holt set the coffee down. "Put it on my screen." The message was short, written in the formal trade language of the Council, which governed over 400 recognized species across the known galaxy. It was a summons, not a trade notice, not a territorial complaint, not the usual diplomatic noise that came through the channels every week. It was a formal invitation to the Chamber of Echoes on Sullivan Prime, the political heart of the galaxy. And it was addressed not just to Earth's ambassador, but to, as the message put it, a representative vessel and crew of the human species. The bridge went quiet. Everyone knew what the Chamber of Echoes was. It was the place where the most important decisions in galactic history had been made for over 12,000 years. Wars had been declared there. Peace treaties had been signed there. And on very rare occasions, species had been honored there. Amy worked through the cultural layers of the message for the next hour, cross-referencing it with her database of Council protocols. She came to Holt's ready room when she was finished. There are only 2 reasons the Secretariat uses this kind of language: a sentencing or a tribute. Since we are not under any known indictment, I believe it is the second one. Holt leaned back in his chair. A tribute. Yes, sir. If I am right, this would be the 20th tribute in the entire recorded history of the Council. The last one was given to the Tyroleans over 800 years ago. Holt thought about that for a moment, then opened a secure channel to Ambassador Nate Calloway, Earth's senior diplomatic envoy, who was already stationed on Sullivan Prime. Calloway's face appeared on the screen. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who had spent years choosing his words before he spoke them. Before his career in politics, he had been a school teacher in Ohio, and he still had the patient tone of someone who was used to explaining difficult things to people who did not want to hear them. "Danny," Calloway said, "I was expecting your call. Tell me what is going on, Nate." Calloway rubbed his forehead. "The Council intends to formally honor humanity for our role in the border collapse. The tribute ceremony is scheduled for 3 days from now." The border collapse. Holt felt something tighten in his chest. It had been 9 years, but the memory had not faded. The Vraxian swarm had breached the outer territories without warning, pouring through the gaps in the defense network like water through a broken dam. Colony worlds fell in days. Entire populations were consumed. And when humanity sent out distress calls to the elder species of the Council, asking for aid, asking for ships, asking for anything at all, the response had been silence. The Dominion of Reth had pulled its fleets back to its own borders. The Athkari Conclave had declared the conflict a regional matter. 3 of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy had watched from safe distances while humans bled and burned at the Corvin line. And humanity had held. For 41 days, a fleet of human vessels had held the passage against a force that outnumbered them by a factor that the tactical analysts still argued about. They held it with broken ships and exhausted crews, and a stubbornness that the galaxy had never seen before from a species so young. When the swarm finally broke and retreated, the human fleet was in ruins. 37 ships lost. Over 11,000 men and women dead. But the line had held, and the galaxy behind it had survived. Now, 9 years later, the Council wanted to say thank you. You do not sound happy about this, Holt said. Calloway shook his head. I am not unhappy about the honor itself. Humanity earned it, but the politics behind it concern me. The Dominion of Reth and the Athkari Conclave opposed this tribute for years. Something changed. I do not yet know what, and that makes me nervous. Holt understood. In galactic politics, gifts rarely came without strings. He set course for Sullivan Prime and informed the crew. The Steadfast was not a warship. It was a diplomatic cruiser, built for long patrols and first contact situations. But it carried a crew of 142 men and women who had served together through difficult times, and every one of them understood what this summons meant. During the 2-day journey, the crew talked. They talked in the mess hall, in the corridors, in the engine room during shift changes. They talked about the tribute tradition. Amy Schultz, who had studied council history more deeply than anyone else on board, explained what she knew. In 12,000 years, only 19 species had been honored. Each one had delivered an acceptance response. Traditionally a long, formal speech, praising the wisdom of the council and expressing deep gratitude for the recognition. These speeches were archived in the Chamber of Echoes and studied for centuries. Some of them were considered among the greatest works of oratory in galactic civilization. So we need a really good speech, said Petty Officer Chris Langley, a young enlisted man from Montana who worked in the communications bay. He was 23 years old and had a quiet way about him that made people forget he was in the room until he spoke. The ambassador has been working on one for weeks, Amy said. Langley nodded slowly, but said nothing else. Holt noticed. He noticed a lot of things about Langley, mostly because the young man reminded him of someone he had lost. On the last night before they reached Sullivan Prime, Holt stood alone on the observation deck. The stars stretched out in front of him, cold and endless. He thought about the 41 days. He thought about the distress calls that went unanswered. He thought about the ships that had gone silent one by one, their names disappearing from the tactical display like candles going out. He thought about the faces of people he would never see again. The council wanted a speech. They wanted gratitude. They wanted humanity to stand before the galaxy and say the right things in the right way so that everyone could feel good about what had happened. Holt closed his eyes. He was not sure he could do that. He was not sure any honest person could. He stood there for a long time, watching the stars, and wondered what a person was supposed to say to a galaxy that had let them bleed.